Hi all, thanks for watching this. This is my SCG lecture, and I'm going to be lecturing about slide design. I think that this is probably going to be more so helpful for the freshmen and sophomores, but even if you're a junior or senior, I think you can learn maybe one or two things from this, but thanks for giving it a watch. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to go ahead and send these slides later because I'm a floating head in the corner. I'm not sure if some of the content's going to get blocked, but we'll talk through most of it and I'll send this, so yeah. So today we're going to talk about two things. The first is sort of the intuition behind what makes a good slide. How do you just look at something and know it's aesthetic? We'll talk about some design principles, look through some slides that work, not just from stock pitches, but other slide decks, and some other tips from years I've spent watching pitches because pitching is probably the most applicable use of slide design in USIT. And then second, we'll talk through some of the execution, how you want to set up your PowerPoint, shortcuts that I think are really useful, and just efficiency on building slides quicker. So starting off with the intuition, first is font. There's a difference between serif and sans serif fonts if you haven't learned this already. So serif fonts are the fonts that have decorative strokes at the end of the letters and sans serif fonts don't. I think the best serif fonts are Garamond probably, avoid Times New Roman. And sans serif, you can use Arial for stock pitches. SF Pro is a font that I really like. It's the Apple default font. And I use this when I'm doing something like a case comp. I use this with Texas Charity Pitch. And whenever I'm doing like consulting related things, I would really avoid Calibri here. You can also use 2 Cent MT. That's another sans serif font that I like. Personally, I think that sans serif fonts can make slides look really sweaty. This is like a good or bad thing, right? Exercises with caution. It can either look very effortlessly intellectual or it can sort of look DTM. So kind of take it as you will here. Here's an example of some Garamond slides. This is for the Norwegian pitch, and I'll kind of reference some of these decks over and over. This is what Arial looks like on a stock pitch. This is from a UPenn team pitch that I really liked. I really liked their deck. And as you can see here, it kind of just looks like very, I don't know, crisp and bold. And I kind of really like the way Arial looks in stock pitches sometimes. This is SF Pro, like I was talking about, the Apple font that I used on Texas Charity Pitch my sophomore year. And one caveat with SF Pro is that it is a Apple native font, so you can't download it on Microsoft. So what I did for this deck was I had my entire team build the deck in Calibri, and then I went on my Mac. And obviously you don't want to use PowerPoint on your Mac, but I went through and I changed all of the text boxes to SF Pro just because I liked how it looked, and I exported it from my MacBook. So if you're going to use SF Pro, you're probably going to have to build it out and then convert all the font later, but I think it's really worth it. I think this font is really beautiful. Moving on to color, most of the time you're going to want to use a specific color palette for a company. So I'm assuming like if you're doing investment banking or something, you have to stick to the company colors. But regardless, you want to create a palette in a slide master. And you do this by sort of just creating different rectangles and sort of putting them to the side. You want to use the eyedropper to match the logo to the hex code. And the shortcut for this is Alt HSFE, but I would just add this shortcut to your quick access toolbar because you're probably going to be using the eyedropper a lot. And what I like to do is, personally, I think that using accent colors, unless it's necessary, for example, an accent color is in a company logo, so your logo has 2 colors. Other than that, I try not to use accent colors, and instead I just like to use different shades of the same color just because I think this looks better. I pick one dark version, a saturated version, and a light version, and then I always like using gray in my slide decks. I think gray is an amazing way to replace the need for an accent color just because gray is cleaner and the grayscale looks better, and so I'll just use a couple of grays. More on stock pitches, I think sometimes it's not even necessary to use the company colors always. Like, yes, if you're doing something that requires it, then yeah, but like a lot of the time I will just use blue regardless of what the company color is because I just think this is so much better than using an ugly color like yellow, orange, purple, or brown. Just fade those colors, don't use them. And yeah, I think blue is the best color if you want to use a color just to like make your deck. And if the company color is too light or brilliant means that it's very like, it pops at you, I guess. Like the example is over here. This is like a very like bright blue, but then you can change this to a sort of teal color and that'll look really nice if you just drop the saturation down and it'll sort of be within the same color family, right? And as an example of like, okay, this is a blue, but even though it's blue, I don't think you can just use this color as is by eyedropping it. It's a medium blue, and it looks a little awkward if you put white text on it or if you put black text on it. And so for the pitch, we chose a blue darker than this and a blue lighter than this instead of just using the blue as is. So just making some intentional color choices. More discourse on color. As you can see, most companies, if they're not like a food company, they don't want to use red or yellow because those are ugly. I mean, yes, people use them because it's visually appealing for you to like think about food. So yes, McDonald's or Coca-Cola use red or yellow. But as you can see, like Facebook, Apple, Samsung, Google, like they're kind of straying away, and like blue is like the primary color, right? And I think this is more proof that you want to stick towards those sort of cool tone blue colors. What is hue? Hue is sort of the warmth behind a color. Is it a cool tone color? Is it a warm color? And it's sort of the side of the color pane you're on. So as you can see, this is the eyedropper tool, and all the colors that are on the left side are warm toned, and then the colors that are on the right side are cool toned. And you don't really have to think super deeply about it. I don't really pull up the color pane to think about it. It's just like an intuition. Is this a cool color or warm color? And the reason this matters is it kind of matters what font you use with it. So you want to use warm toned colors with serif font and cool toned colors with sans serif font. And you can see here that the different reds, blues, and greens based on their undertone definitely do look better with serif fonts or sans serif fonts. And so given a choice, if you're like using Garamond, try to use like warmer tones instead of cooler tones, and vice versa. This is sort of like an example in practice. We sort of picked a blue that was like right in the middle, and as such, you can use Garamond with it, even though blue generally is more of a cool toned color, right? So, just kind of putting this into practice. And I think that a good way to tie this back, actually, John sort of mentioned this to me, and it kind of sparked my thoughts back to art history, which I took in high school. And I think a lot of design principles can be, thrown back to art history. So looking at the Mondrian, Peter Mondrian was a Dutch painter and an art theoretician, and regarded as one of the best 20th century abstract artists. And sort of the way that he did design was he always made sure to have three primary colors, so red, yellow, and blue, three primary values, which are gray, black, and white, and then two primary directions, vertical and horizontal. And he used asymmetry as a guiding tool. And I think that this is a recurring theme that you'll see as we look through some of the slides later on in the deck that I think are good example slides. But instead of having everything be perfectly balanced, you want to have balance, but also tension. And so he used asymmetry as a guiding tool to add hierarchy, to draw attention, to feel intentional. And we'll look at more of this in effect, but just look at the Mondrian art style and kind of like, reference it later on. So what is this tension I'm talking about? It is contrast, and contrast is the most important rule of design. And we'll talk about what low visual contrast and high visual contrast are with examples, but just think about it right now as if you have a lot of text, you want it to be easy to the eye, and you want to employ low visual contrast. So that means using a white or a light gray background with black text. Avoid using color here. And if there's a little bit of text that you want to emphasize, then you want to employ high visual contrast. So this means we're going to use pale colored backgrounds with black text or dark colored backgrounds with white text. And the overall goal is that within each slide, you want to have 80% low contrast elements and 20% high contrast elements. And then within the deck overall, you want to use 20% high contrast elements and 80% low contrast elements. Slides, sorry. You want to have like 80% of the slides be low contrast slides and then 20% be high contrast slides. And I'll show you what this looks like. So this is an example of a slide. So what are the low contrast elements? These gray text boxes here with a lot of text, and the text on the bottom that just has no background. Whereas the high visual contrast elements are, the text at the top here. So the line that's like street thinks it's a binary story, high demand or high pricing. That's not a lot of words, right? And because of that, I chose to use a colored background instead of using a gray background or any header that I use. So why does our approach win? It's like color with white text. And these are high contrast elements, or even the numbers to this side, right? These are high contrast. They sort of pop at you. And as you can see, 20% of this slide is like these low contrast elements, and 80% is these low contrast elements, and 20% is high contrast. What is relief? And we'll sort of talk about how you use relief overall in a deck, but relief is sort of like a technique where you want to use negative space as a relief to the eye in a way. And this empty space is intentional and it's not wasted. And when you reduce the cognitive load, it makes the elements stand out. So you can see this with the fifth season, like this guy pops at you because the back is just negative space. And you want to do this in a deck, right? You don't want like every single slide to have a bunch of text on it. I mean, if you have a slide limit, obviously like you have no other choice. But if you're doing a GM pitch or something, like you don't have a slide limit. You don't want every slide to be like a bunch of text. You want to have a couple of slides as relief that pop at you, right? So for example, when I was doing Texas charity pitch, this is an example of like a relief slide. I think after we introduced like the problem at hand, we just had this black slide. Most of the slides are white, but this was a black slide, so it sort of pops at you and it forces you to reckon with the text that's on the screen. And there's not a lot of it, right? And that looks very good. And obviously, like I said, you don't want it to be more than 20%. Don't use it too liberally. This is like a screenshot of like all the slides in my deck. And as you can see, I only had these black slides a couple of times. And that way, every time they appeared, it was like you were forced to look at it and reckon with the text. But like I said, you can even do this in a stock pitch. So when I was doing, I think, the TMT pitch in the fall, we were pitching EchoStar, and obviously want to talk about the industry overview, but we thought this was a really important thing to talk about, how the big three dominate the market. And so we had this like one transition slide where you just saw this one graph, and it was like a relief because people had to pay attention to it because it wasn't just like like clicking through all the slides. So you can even do this in the stock pitch, and I think you totally should if there's no slide limit. And this is another example of a relief slide. This was a variance to consensus slide that we built for Norwegian, and this was inspired by a Northeastern team's slide layout. And I really liked how they force you to look at this one graph. Obviously, when you go through a thesis point and you just talk about, oh, these are the reasons, the blah, 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 and then you could just cram like this is the impact overall, this is our variance and consensus at like the bottom of the thesis slide, maybe that impact gets lost. But so what we did for this was, instead of doing that, we just had the thesis content slides, and then after that, this was the culmination of that thesis. This is our variance to sell side, quarter by quarter. And I thought this was a really nice visualization. And it was the only thing on the slide pretty much, right? So you're forced to reckon with it. So this is another example of relief. Here's another one from that UPenn team that I showed you earlier. This was the investment opportunity setup. And so once again, they sort of force you to understand like, oh, heroic assumptions are not needed to unlock value, with a very simple graphic, like 1 or 2 lines of text. And I think this is very, very well done. And you don't see things like this very often. I've never seen this graphic in like literally any other deck, and it was very unique and it stuck with me. I saw this like freshman year, and it's been a slide that I constantly reference to this day. Another technique that I think is important to do for like a good slide deck is color coding for the subconscious. And this is a way to make all of the things very cohesive. I'm not the type of person that thinks that you need to always have the same header types like on every single slide. Like this was one slide, and I obviously have the blue background with white text, but it's not like on every single slide we were doing that. I think maybe if you're at a bank, they might want you to do it like that, but I don't think this is necessary 100% of the time. But I still think that you should try to have the same sorts of things within each sort of element. So I put all of the, blue background with white text, those were always headers. And then whenever I had these like rounded gray boxes with gray dots, I always did like a subtitle for like a graph. And that was just something that keeps the subconscious like, oh, this is always going to be the same sort of thing. And like when I use these black boxes, they always had the white text on them. And if you only read the black boxes when you're reading the entire pitch, you kind of understood the story. We kind of talked about our variance every single time we had like a black box with like white text. And I think this is good. A lot of the time people will write out their strap lines, the strap lines are like the subtitle lines, right? And they would write out these strap lines, and that would sort of just be the story. But I don't think you need to only do it in like the line below the title of a slide. You can put these sort of like story strap lines like throughout the deck wherever you want, and we did them in black. And I think this is like the big takeaway of like intuitively what is good slide design. You really want to avoid the 4 quadrants at like all costs. This is basically the default slide design that I think people use in stock pitches. Is like you have the title, and then you have like the 4 like kind of boxes of content. And I think if you can avoid this, like that is really what makes a good slide. And how do you kind of intuitively come to this? You want to experiment with like different cuts of a slide. So going back to the Mondrian, you want to like cut a slide into half and then one half into another half, or cutting the slide into like horizontal halves and then cutting one of those halves into thirds. And the way that you can really workshop this is like, go on PowerPoint and like create those blue boxes and like type out like as placeholders like what you would want in those blue boxes. And this is also good because if you just do this on every slide, which I do a lot of the time, it's a good way to help out freshmen understand exactly what you want them to execute. If you just like leave them with a slide with like blue boxes in specific areas with like white text, like they're forced to execute this vision. And I think this is like really important. Avoid these 4 quadrants at all costs. And another thing I wanted to like tell you guys about is like building a design toolkit. This is so important. Like know different ways that you can write out text boxes. So here's a couple of examples, like a gray box with no outline, black text with like italicized as well, right? Or for example, the classic text box with the bottom underline. This is another design thing that I really liked. This is from Celebrate. I think first had this catalyst path style. I think this is so cute. Like the line with like the circles. Like I think that's so adorable. And I constantly use that. Or these like numbers here. So like think about elements that you think are aesthetic. These are some that I really like and I constantly reuse them. So build your own design toolkit. In terms of some like little reminders on graphs, for graphs, you always want to like delete the graph lines. And I know that like when you're doing like science fair or you're like taught in I think like public school, like, oh, this is like, it's like cheating if you edit the graph axes. Like your graph's always got to start at 0 to not be misleading. I think when you do stock pitches, like that's not really true. You can probably edit the axis to make the bar chart value delta more pronounced between the two bars that you're kind of comparing. So always edit the graph axis min and max to make those differences pronounced. And you can just do this when you go to axis options and bounds. Remove the default graph title if you want, and definitely whatever you do, change the font type because the default will always be this ugly sans serif font. I also think waterfalls are cute, and I think that they should be used more often. This is a type of graph that I think people don't use enough. And a couple more reminders, have a separate page in Excel for all your graphs so it links very cleanly and everyone can just look at the graphs on the Excel file and like know where they are at all times. And then also fade the default PowerPoint tables, and those are the ones with the alternating fill colors on rows. Just build your own, either natively on PowerPoint or within Excel. I think that these PowerPoint tables look really ugly and quite lazy, frankly. I'm not sure if I'm like covering this like risk and mitigants fully, but like what you want to do for risk and mitigants is kind of vary the level of sweatiness versus like the graphics based on what the deck is for. So on the top here is from the UPenn Teams pitch. This is a risk and mitigant format that I love. I use this one all the time because, as you guys probably know, when you're doing a stock pitch, risk and mitigants are something that you will spend probably like 20 or 30 seconds presenting, and then you will go back to in Q&A. And as such, it's very useful to treat it almost like an appendix slide where you just throw a bunch of text on to show that you did all the work and then kind of touch on it later. I think that's why this format looks so nice. At the bottom here, you can see this is one that I did for a case comp that we ultimately did well at. And this is, I think, very cute. This like low threat, medium threat, high threat, probability of occurrence, severity of risk type risk and mitigants thing. And I think this is another cute format. I also co-opted this from someone back in my day. So just kind of like have different versions of risk and mitigants. I think these are a couple. Where do you find inspiration though? So obviously, like as a junior, I think like through the years I've accumulated all these decks that I really like, and if you've worked with me on a pitch, I probably like send you a email with like a bunch of different files of like, this is what we're going for, look at these decks as slide inspiration. But the truth is like slide deck should not be just like merely limited to whatever you see in like a typical pitch. So you shouldn't just like build a deck by going like company overview, industry overview, thesis 1, 2, 3, valuation, and like make sure those are the only slides. You can and you should make slides on whatever content you want, right? Like a slide doesn't just have to be one of these options. It can either be something that you organically think of as like, I want to make a slide on this for my pitch, or you can find inspiration. So either through stock pitches from like other teams, or like you can look at hedge fund presentations. They sometimes have really cool inspiration slides. And let me just show you what I mean by this. Like here's a couple of slides that are not just the very basic stock pitch slides that we might look at. And I think these are good and they should be used more often. So find inspiration like this. So this is, like I said, the variance to consensus inspiration that we took from the Northeastern Student Value Fund who pitched Celebrate back in my freshman year at TSP. I think it's beautiful, right? This like data-driven view drives large variance to consensus, and we really liked this one. They also did this slide that I liked called, why does this opportunity exist, them versus us? This is so clean, right? Like them. This is like a screenshot of their revenue build. Us, here's a screenshot of our revenue build. And like a quote from a sell-side analyst. And I think something that's really good about this slide that I think you should do more in stock pitches, if you're doing it at comp, like obviously it depends on how objective you're supposed to be, but this was like for a stock pitch that, you know, people were trying to emphasize like, oh, like this is why our pitch is so good. And I think like this was as such like a good slide. So use more narrative and like pronoun driven language occasionally when you can. Here's another one that I really liked. This is from Alta Fox. They post their research publicly, actually, so you can go look at this pitch. They did this on NATL. Shout out to Justin for sending me this like pitch, like this slide idea specifically. He like pointed out this like multiple slide, and I think this was such a unique slide idea because they were basically like the multiple itself is artificially depressed. And they plotted like NTMPE of companies versus like EBITDA CAGR to show that their company had a much better like CAGR, but still like a worse multiple. And I think that that was such a unique slide to look at, spending just an entire thing talking about the multiples. So we did this for Norwegian actually, and I'm not sure if we presented this, I don't remember, but we did put this in our appendix at the very least. But this is so important because a lot of the time you collapse the best parts of your thesis in a way to fit a slide deck, but then you lose those like really good points that you might just like articulate verbally, right? So just make sure that you always have them in your deck. You're not just like collapsing them. Some final tips on intuition of design and other musings. Build a folder of decks you like, bookmark slide layouts you're a fan of, and like I said, it's very helpful when you're directing people to make slides a specific way. Another tip is to just make your own default pitch slide master with your preferred margins and font sizes, so you don't have to make a new one from scratch every time, and you can just send these to the GMs when you're working on pitches. And a slight aside on page size, I think widescreen is better than the default that PowerPoint gives you for stock pitches. So this is an example of like a standard like layout, but most of the time I like using the widescreen. And like I said earlier, slides are a story, so even though it's common to just title slides and throw the irrelevant information on them, you should 1,000,000% rearrange, refit content on slides as you see fit. So most of the time when I'm going through and I'm editing some like deck for a pitch, I will just like move the information around. Like I'll build new slides, I'll reformat the information just so that they flow together cleaner. It's a story, right? Slide design is not just about like making the boxes look pretty, but it's about making sure that the story fits properly on every slide. And the way that I do this is I write out the subtitle strap lines first. I make sure the story works. Then I go ahead and I add content. And I already talked about the pronoun stuff. Build a tough appendix, right? If you have slide limit, like throw a lot of things in it so you can flip to it during Q&A. This is just so much tougher. And another nice touch is like an earnings update. So after you get into a comp, if they post like an update on earnings, like making a slide for just like an earnings update, I think it's really, really cute. And more tips, like always paste that formatting. Don't paste things from Excel's images, and like, yeah, fade the 4 quadrants. And then more further learning on aesthetics, I think that for me, the way that I gained an intuitive understanding of slide design was through, I guess, like artistic pursuits like throughout my childhood, but also I think art history was like a very life-changing class that I took in high school. But art history is like still publicly available, like the AP course, so maybe just like click through it if you're interested. It teaches you a lot about design and aesthetics. Here's a couple of textbooks I like. If you're interested, go to art galleries, play around on Canva. Canva is like a great way to just like test out your design skills. And also subscribe to Art Every Day by this guy. He does like a little art history lesson every day and you get it in your inbox. I think it's very nice to look at. Okay, part 2, execution. How do you actually build slides like this though? Okay, so if you learn nothing else, it's that you should always hold the shift key down when you're doing things on PowerPoint. It really, really helps. When you hold shift key and you drag elements, they auto-align. If you hold the shift key down and you draw a shape, it makes the height to width ratio constant. And this is perfect for drawing circles or squares. And if you hold the shift key down when you draw a line, it forces the line to be straight. So it's a very goated key. There's also a copy and align hierarchy. Do not do Control-C, Control-V. This is not what you should be doing. Instead, like I said, click and drag is obvious, it moves an object, but if you hit Control and you drag, it creates a copy of the object and drags it for you. And if you hit Shift and drag, it allows you to just move an object and see it in vertical and horizontal alignment, right? So if you do Control, Shift, drag, this creates a copy and it moves it in alignment. So you should always do this. More shortcuts. Alt-WM opens a slide master and Alt-WL collapses a slide master. I didn't think these were very helpful, but then whenever you're trying to fix things on your slide master, it's just really, really useful. So I would also keep these in your back pocket. You guys probably know these Control-G to group elements and Control-Shift-G to ungroup elements. Duplication. Control-D duplicates objects, and I'm presenting this right now on my MacBook. Otherwise, I would unshare my screen right now and like show you these shortcuts in PowerPoint. But Control-D has this hidden jump feature. And what this basically means is if you do Control-D on an object and then you drag it a little bit, and it, like, you know, let's just say I have an element like here, and then I like Control-D it over here, and then I hit Control-D again, it'll just automatically like duplicate the next element with the same alignment gap, right? So you can just Control D, Control D, Control D, Control D, and you can just go like da 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 at the exact like, you know, angle that you like dragged it at. So this is the hidden jump feature. Me explaining this probably doesn't make sense. Just try it out for yourself. It's very nice. And then Control Shift D duplicates a slide. More shortcuts. Control Z undoes, Control Y redoes. So interplay Control Z and Y to see the difference between like an edit. Like if you're like, oh guys, you like this edit, like don't like hit the undo button and the redo button, just like Control Z, Control Y, and like you can like see the difference between a change to decide if you like the change. These are more shortcuts that I think are very, very worth it. So I would add them to your quick access toolbar because they're a lot more annoying to constantly type out. Alt NSH inserts a shape, and because a text box is a type of shape in PowerPoint, like it inherits the shape properties, this also takes care of inserting text boxes. Alt HSF is shape fill, and Alt HSFE is shape fill with the eyedropper. Alt HGA is probably the most important one on this slide. It's the align function. And so you basically definitely should put this in your quick access toolbar. And like you would do like Alt HGAC for like center or something like that. And when you're setting up your slide master, you want to turn on the ruler to like see the margins. And you can also use grid lines to set up the initial align on the slide master. This one is like super useful. I think Alt HFF, it's like jump to edit the font style. And if you hit tab after, like, let's just say you do Alt HFF, you like type in Arial, instead of hitting enter to select and then clicking to the edit the font size to like type that out, you hit tab instead of enter after typing in the font name, and it'll just jump to edit the font size. Once again, try this out and you'll know what I mean. The biggest rule of thumb, though, is that you should format once and reuse often. Like, it would be so annoying if you had to constantly, like, build a shape, Alt NSH, and then Alt HSF, shape fill, and then Alt HGA, align, like, Alt HF. Like, that's would be so annoying if you just did this on every single box that you did. So instead, you should just format once and reuse often. Control Shift C copies formatting, and then Control Shift V paste it. So the goal is like make one shape or element perfect, then you duplicate it, group it, align together, and then the key to speeding up your PowerPoint building is just grouping and multiplying. And some final best practices, you want to make different slide deck versions or duplicate slides for version control. Like never just edit directly, always duplicate slides, always have multiple versions. And when you're building out a deck, add shapes as like little to-do flags, and you can also flag slides as done. So these are just some best practices. But yeah, thanks so much for watching my presentation. I'll go ahead and attach these shortcuts as like a doc when I send this out. But if you have any questions, like don't hesitate to reach out to me. But yeah, thank you for watching.